Hello, everybody, and welcome to Proofread, where we're talking today with CJ Cox, just about random worldviews and more secular humanism. CJ, how are you? Welcome, and it's really good to see you. It's been way too long, as I mentioned earlier. How are you feeling tonight?
I appreciate that, man, and I'm doing very well, thank you. Appreciate you having me on here today. I've also been looking forward to these dialogues. I know had at the end of the last show we did on my channel, we were talking about doing a part two, and then just never actually did anything about it. So I appreciate you reaching out to me so that we could finally get this going. It's been a long time coming, and thank you. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm fantastic. I just got up, so my day hasn't started really. So we'll see how it goes. It could be great, could be awful, and not enough has elapsed to see. But no, I've got my coffee. It should be fantastic. So I really want to talk with you as sort of we talked about theology last time, and I promised, hey, most of it was on your worldview, and I think it's only fair if we talk about mine for a while, and you get to ask me questions about what I believe and why. And I don't know. Well, first off, if you don't mind, why don't you tell everybody, who you are and what you do and how we sort of know each other, kind of thing, and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. So, for those who don't know, my name is CJ Cox. I run the YouTube channel, The Synagogue. I actually have the name underneath here as my headline, where I talk Christian apologetics and theology, usually in the form of open rooms, but we're going to start turning back to the podcast as well as a lot more interviews and even some short form content. I tend to describe myself as a reformed fundamentalist. So, for those who don't know what those words mean, basically, reformed, i.e., Calvinist, and fundamentalist, i.e., strict and literal interpretations of the Bible. I also do another channel rather, called the Synagogue News, where I talk politics, but that's not necessarily relevant to our conversation today. So, the way actually me and Mark were acquainted was through my open rooms. They tend to be fairly late, which actually works perfectly when you don't live in the United States, because for you that's actually kind of just regular day, at least for both English-speaking areas of not in the United States. So that's how our conversations ended up getting started. Is just kind of I guess you could call it luck of the draw in a sense. And so far I think this will be only the second scheduled conversation, but in those open rooms, I think we've had 5 or 6 of them, and always fairly long.
And I know that you enjoy discussing morality as I do, and sort of the more philosophical stuff. So I really enjoy the conversations with you, and sort of I understand where your morality comes from, sort of from the Bible, as as a believer in the Bible. But what do you know about secular humanism? What do you understand about it, or can you give me a rundown of what you think it is?
Yeah. So my surface level understanding is just that humanism, typically defined, is a belief in the ability of human beings to source and be the foundation of morality by way of our own ideas. Whether that's actually objective or subjective tends to be varying from humanist to humanist, but that never my understanding is that it is this continuation of the Renaissance idea that we are capable of having a morality from within ourselves and having societies and mores from within ourselves without necessarily having a requirement of a deity or platonic objects or things of that nature. The interesting thing, of course, being that a lot of the earliest humanists, like Leon Alberti and so on, were actually Christians. but that still was their idea. And the reason I point that out is just to say, I've always found that perplexing. Obviously, it's not a problem for those of you who are secular, but for them to have this idea of faith in the human person as being the source of these rules and mores and stuff like that, while nevertheless affirming a deity, I always found that to be kind of a little bit funny, but nevertheless, they did it and they're very intelligent men. But that's the sort of the surface level understanding. A little bit deeper of an understanding, I think, would be that humanism is, and this will sound probably a little bit more dismissive than I intend it to be. So I want to just say beforehand that the spirit of this comment is not meant to be dismissive. I think it tends to be a little bit of a catch-all for a wide array of opinions. Like, for example, the things you'll get from Christopher Hitchens, who I think we could probably describe as a libertarian Marxist, both politically and philosophically, are wildly different than what you might get from David Silverman, who is also a secular humanist. Politically, he tends to be a little bit more right-wing, and as far as his views of morality, not super big on libertarian free will or things of that nature, which is also going to be different from a Dillahunty, which is also going to be different from a more philosophically robust humanist, which for whatever reason, the first one that comes to my mind is Nietzsche, but I know there's a lot more modern ones that I could have referenced. And I don't even know if Nietzsche even counts as a humanist, but nevertheless.
I don't think so. Nietzsche, he really was a bit of a nihilist, to be honest with you. But so it's kind of, yes, basically. I mean, I don't refute any of that stuff. Definitely in there is the belief of abilities of humans to come to morality without having anything supernatural. And it's not just a god, it's really anything supernatural. So, without a guiding force or some sort of supernatural ancestor worship, anything supernatural. So it isn't really just a god. And yes, the earliest humanists were Christian and deists as well. So the deists, you can sort of understand how humanism or secular humanism can fit, because a day, so the deist belief that a god does not intervene in the world, that doesn't give you any understanding of how to provide a moral system. It leaves you to do that by yourself, so you can understand that. As far as being a catch-all, I think that you could leverage the same sort of thing against Christianity being a catch-all, that there's people in Christianity that have different beliefs. That the Southern Baptist Church will be vastly different than the Church of England, for instance, and yet they're both Christian. I think that is kind of true, that with any belief system, you're going to have people of vastly different ideas, while the underlying premise is still the same. So humanism is based upon basically, it's a utilitarian system based around human well-being and what we know about humans that lead to a good life, essentially. So we're really so would you agree that we can sort of at least come to an understanding between us of what makes a human physically healthy?
Well, so physically healthy, using that terminology, I think the answer would be yes, because that's kind of a medical thing. In other words, you can scientifically demonstrate whether or not somebody is healthy.
Sure.
Where my pushback would initially be with that is I don't know that healthy is necessarily what each individual humanist might mean by good. So, for example, I've heard some who might use happy instead. And of course, happy and healthy may not necessarily be the same thing. In fact, very often they're not. So while I would agree with the statement as is, certainly, that we can agree on what it is that makes a human being physically healthy. as opposed to
Yes.
mentally healthy or emotionally healthy or something like that.
Yeah.
I also would wonder if that would be necessarily the goal of each individual, although it's, of course, I guess we're speaking more specifically about you anyways, so maybe that's not even a relevant comment.
Oh, that's fine. So that's just, and as you said, you hit the nail on the head saying, hey, that's not emotionally or mentally. So the next question is how do we tell what a human needs to be emotionally and mentally healthy? And that is a really good point. I guess first off, I'm sort of establishing that, hey, we can tell what makes a human physically healthy. Sure, that so we can sort of say, hey, there's certain things that a human needs in order to be physically healthy. Like we need food, we need water, we need sleep, we need shelter. Things like this, we know that we can place down as well. If we want to be healthy, then we ought to do a certain bunch of things, and that's on the physical side. It gets a lot more complicated when it comes to the emotional side or the mental side, where you're basically saying, hey, what does a human need to be mentally healthy? I do acknowledge that some people have a more how would you say it, a more sort of pleasure orientated affirmation. Secular humanism doesn't really get into that at all. That's sort of utilitarianism. But what it does talk about is humans and societies flourishing. So when you talk about happiness, for instance, happiness, as I just had a conversation with a psychologist yesterday, it's kind of fleeting. It's not like an emotion you can sustain. It sort of comes and goes. Really, when we're talking about when a person flourishes is when they have good quality of life. Like they have periods of happiness. They have sort of contentment in what they've achieved. They have a lot of these different things, and we've tried to quantify that over the years. So we sort of come up with these fundamental needs that humans generally all want. Things like love and affirmation, things like the ability to feel like you've accomplished things. And these are documented in psychological text. Are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So that's sort of an old model, and they've sort of dropped the pyramid shape, but they still do keep these fundamental human needs as sort of psychological needs. So when we're talking about societal flourishing and human flourishing, where humanists are really looking at what do we need as humans in order to have a good quality of life, to be, I mean, happiness is the wrong word, because sort of happiness implies a sort of, a levity kind of thing, while really we're just talking about having a good, a content life, a life that you are satisfied with, and therefore building a society that you're satisfied with, because obviously that is comprised of humans. If the humans aren't satisfied, then overall the society can't be. So we kind of get these oughts from what people want to be satisfied, and I'm not claiming that's objective. I think that it is. There's nothing objective to say that you have to want a good life. I don't think anything makes you do that, but it is a fact that it's ubiquitous that people do want to have a content and relatively good life.
You could almost say it that I think maybe this way: everybody wants to be satisfied, but what satisfies everybody is not objective.
Well, correct, but we can identify these commonalities. As I said, I use the word ubiquitous because I realize that universal sort of says that everybody wants it, and I don't want to use the word universal, but we can identify these certain things that are universals. Sort of I believe they're called human givens. They are the fundamental things, sort of like the Maslow's hierarchy, that makes up what we need to feel satisfied as humans. Now, I'm not saying that is objective. I'm just saying it's ubiquitous throughout all societies on Earth.
Yeah, and so what I would want to insert into the conversation, I think, at this point,
Sure.
would be kind of because typically when we're having conversations about secular humanism, and correct me if I'm wrong here, what we're kind of trying to get at is a conversation primarily about morality, right? Like there can be conversations about how best to structure a society and stuff like that, and they may and often are intimately related to the conversation of morality, but they're not necessarily the same. Just as an example, a capitalist might believe that it's a good idea for somebody to give to charity, but that is obviously not going to necessarily be a part of his capitalism. And if you want to make it even stricter, you could say even in a like on Ayn Rand, right? I think I said that right. Anyways, so the insertion then I would want to have into the conversation there is, can we derive a morality from human flourishing? And I would posit that the answer is probably no. And the reason I would posit that is, which of course will probably be a good deal of our conversation, is that I think that, for one, the right thing to do is very often contrary to human flourishing. And for two, there are means of creating great flourishing that are actually quite detrimental. And so you have to start, caveating with, okay, well, maybe flourishing not just for our society, but for all societies collectively to the best of our ability, and so on and so forth. So just to give an example, I guess, of that really quick, one that I have initially heard from C.S. Lewis in his Abolition of Man. Courage is typically seen as a virtue. Of course, not by everybody, but nevertheless, just generally kind of hinting at that ubiquitous nature, right?
Sure.
And courage will often manifest itself in the way that one does something perilous with bravery, right? So, for example, going to war, if indeed it is a just war, we'll just assume that for the moment. That's where you'll see the display of courage. But of course, a war is very much contrary to human flourishing, and certainly contrary to the flourishing of the individual who is at war. So you might say that this war is necessary for maybe the preservation of a certain ideal or ethnic group or something along those lines, but it's certainly not going to be necessary for the preservation of the soldier at a bare minimum, right? His flourishing takes a back seat to whatever the goal is, even if the goal is perfectly just, which of course sometimes it definitely is. So it seems to me that that's one of many examples where there is a rub between the flourishing, whether that be of the individual or of a large group, and that which is maybe considered to be just or good. And to, I guess, to put it with its finest point, I think you would be hard pressed to, without assuming certain transcendent truths, such as preserving posterity being a good thing and stuff like that. I think you would be hard pressed to convince somebody that their courage did anything for their personal flourishing. In fact, it could be very detrimental for their flourishing, and if they're head of household or something like that, the flourishing of their families, and even potentially for the flourishing of the entire society. Like, for example, if you have a hopeless conflict against an evil empire, one might say that the wisest thing to do from a flourishing perspective is just to give up. and maybe they won't be as rough with you, but nevertheless, that is giving up against a evil empire. And of course, people have made these pragmatic decisions throughout history. But I hope the point is made clearly in that it does seem like this is an area where both individual and societal, and you could even say familial flourishing, can very often be at odds with what we would typically consider to be good to do.
Okay. Just quickly, Pinworm, thank you so much. $4 super sticker, which you can't see it, but it's a lady saying for you. So thank you so much, Pinworm. So yeah, we've got basically the tug and pull between what you need to flourish and what society needs to flourish. So we kind of identify that there's certain things that are rights for you, because humans need them to flourish. They are basic human needs, like your bodily autonomy, like your freedom and your sense of identity and things like that. But there is nothing saying that you cannot, and people often do, give up some of those rights or their own well-being in order to preserve the well-being of the society you're in. Now, you sort of said, oh, well, we've got to make it the same over multiple societies. So really, I'm talking about the global society. So humanism looks at humans as one society. We're all just part of the same, what's the word? The global village, if you've ever heard that term. That we're all part of this big society. So I'm not really talking individual countries at this point. But this sort of tug and pull between different ideas and different commitments to your morals exists in any moral system. The Christian has to decide whether they are going to submit to the secular authority or whether they're going to follow what the Bible says, and depending on the interpretation. And we've known that in the past, the Catholic Church has made egregious errors with what it has done. So this sort of discussion around where should I draw the line of my own flourishing and how much should I contribute to society, while it's important, it certainly isn't something that is uncommon. So sort of your examples there were sort of and C.S. Lewis, I'm not a huge fan of C.S. Lewis. I think that he sort of said a few things that weren't particularly great. I noticed that a lot of theists do quote him, but I think that's more for his views on theism than anything else. But sort of a hopeless conflict against an evil empire. A lot of humanists would decide and would say that it is as you need to have your basic autonomy, your basic freedom, so bodily autonomy and your autonomy of identity and things like that, that is something that they would do. They would sacrifice their flourishing, because it's not only concerned with the individual. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong with secular humanism. They think, oh, well, it's just you looking after yourself, and that's not true. It's impossible to have, like, if that evil empire is threatening to make your life miserable, basically, if it is sort of, about to implement all kinds of laws that take away your fundamental human needs, then fighting that is something that may be something that is completely warranted and something you ought to do under humanism. A lot of humanists and even a lot of sort of liberals, they will be very accommodating up until a point. And that's why you get sort of certain phrases where they sort of say, fuck around and find out, because they will limit a lot of behavior right up until those fundamental needs are threatened. And once those fundamental needs are threatened, the ought kicks in, that you ought to protect those at all cost, because that's what secular humanism that's what its aim is.
So, yeah, and there's a lot I think that is agreeable, and a lot I think I would have some pushback on. I think because the pushback is always more exciting, right? I think to
I'm not really concerned with what exciting. Sorry, CJ. I'm not I'm kind of lamenting this whole idea of, you know what, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. Sorry, just go ahead. This whole idea of you have to do what's entertaining. I don't think so.
And to be fair, I was only a joke.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you're totally fine. I was just clarifying, just in case. But so, with the example of a hopeless fight against an evil empire, which is one of the ones I find to be most interesting to explore, really from either morality, but especially from a humanistic morality, or even any subjective morality for that matter, because of course they're not always related to humanism, but I digress. So when I say a hopeless fight, sort of locked into the assumption is this idea that you probably, or you might even say are guaranteed to, not really succeed in your endeavor, right? So as an example that I think might be appealing to many in the audience, the Polish had fought bravely, valiantly against the Germans in 1939. Outside of the miracle Hail Mary, snowball chance, whatever you'd like to say with your given analogy, there was just really no way they were going to win that fight. I mean, they had cavalry and knights, for crying out loud, right? Versus panzer tanks and the most well-oiled war machine in Europe. And history reflected that. They fell within months. And the penalty for Polish society for not giving in, even after they had been conquered, was very, very steep, right? Such that they can claim, and it's amazing to even claim something like this considering everything that happened during World War II, but they can claim to be one of the more abused people groups of that era. Although, of course, other people will give them a run for their money as well, right? So now, from the perspective of flourishing, one could, I think, reasonably ask the question, okay, there is no possibility of us actually preserving what we might consider to be our fundamental human rights and liberties. But there is a possibility of us preserving our lives and maybe even a certain level of bodily autonomy, depending on the specific nation. Of course, in the case of the Nazis, that would not be true, but with certain of them, it might be. With certain evil empires, it's totally possible that it might be true. So we can preserve a certain level of physical flourishing, but at the expense of our rights, our liberties, our national pride, and things of that nature. Or we could decide to fight knowing full well it's probably not going to work, and take the brunt of the penalty, not only in the form of combat, but also in the form of repercussions after the war is lost. And typically, although this is obviously a point that is open to disagreement, I think a lot of people would say that they have a good deal of admiration for the bravery of those who pick the second option, to say, yes, it may be detrimental to my society as at large, and it may even be pointless, kind of a pissing in the wind sort of situation, but I will not stand for whatever it is that you seek to do to me and my family. So if it's a choice between us losing all dignity as well as our lives, or a choice between having somewhat of a physical health, but at the expense of our rights and liberties and national pride and stuff like that, I will be willing to sacrifice my life for that, right? And the reason that I bring that up as an interesting example is because there really is no situation in which you have full human flourishing. But even worse than that, The situation with the most physical flourishing is actually the one where you're not courageous, where you're actually quite cowardly. And very many nations throughout history have experienced exactly that. Hey, I'm not going to fight that guy. He's big and scary, and I'd much rather pay him tribute than have to worry about the destruction of my society. And they made that choice, and for better or worse, very often works for them. But they aren't the ones we tend to remember as these great stallions of bravery and courage, right? We tend to remember the Spartans, though all 300 of them died. Of course, not the whole society, but I think you get the point I'm trying to make, right? So, in such a scenario, it doesn't seem like we're really concerned about flourishing per se as much as we are with these more abstract ideals like nationhood and rights and courage and standing up for yourself and things like that. It's not so much as there food in our bellies or do we have the ability to be content in our labors or other things of that nature, but it's these more like I said, abstract ideals which tend to have their grounding in a kind of traditional morality. And to me, I don't see how a system that is reliant upon flourishing can make a decision one way or the other. But even if it did, it would seem to me like the one that is more akin to physical flourishing is actually the choice that we would typically see as the wrong one. But even then, it's almost like, okay, you're not really having the how do I put this? The flourishing is not the robust kind of flourishing you may otherwise desire anyway. So even then you may see the choice as rather hamstrung. Anyways, I don't want to belittle the point with overloading with language, but
yeah. So first off, what we also remember is the Polish resistance, right? We also do remember that even after they were defeated, they fought on, and there's been a number of cases where, like for instance, England during World War II was a hopeless cause. England was not going to win that. Like there was no hope for England in that situation, and they fought on. There is sometimes it is more than the individual that counts, and humanism promotes species-wide thinking. What do we need for humanity to flourish, all of humans? So when you talk about an evil empire, it may in fact be worth a incredible amount of lives in order for that not to be the death knell of humanity. A truly despotic and sort of the empire that you're describing is such an anathema to human flourishing that I would fight it. I know a lot of secular humanists that would fight it, even laying down their own lives, because the story of humanity, we do not want to end with the destruction through sheer tyranny and brutality that an evil empire would encompass. And those fundamental rights and liberties, you can choose not to believe me, but I know that a lot of people have in the past laid down their life to preserve those fundamental human needs that we're talking about. There is an atheist section in the World War II graveyard in America. I can't, it's slipped my mind. Anyway, there is an atheist section in there for a reason. It's because those people decided that these concepts, these freedoms, and the idea of liberty was worth more than their individual lives. So I have heard leveraged against secular humanists that if laying down your arms is what would be best for your society to survive, then that would be what you would do, without understanding that those fundamental human needs we believe in so sincerely that we are prepared to fight to preserve those needs in both us and our fellow humans. So I think that you're underestimating just how important those are to us, that they may be more important than my life. They may be more important than thousands of lives. They may be more important than millions of lives. otherwise you would spend your time in absolute misery throughout the species with no end. And so this idea of food in our bellies and content, I think it's sort of, if you'll forgive me, I think it's very superficial view to what a secular humanist actually believes. And I think that traditional morality that you're talking about, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you mean sort of religious morality. We know that sort of traditional morality has gotten things horrendously wrong in the past. Things like slavery and things like colonization and things like sort of the some of the things that we've based some of these wars on. And the wars themselves, we never know when they're hopeless. And I think that England is a testament to that. I mean, England sent away its monetary reserve to Canada because the leaders of England thought that England would fall. They were almost certain of it, and they were prepared to continue that fight from Canada, from the colonies. If you didn't know that tidbit about World War II, that the English thought they would lose. And it was only sort of people like, for instance, Alan Turing, if you're unfamiliar with him, was probably the single biggest person to win World War II for the Allies. Are you familiar with him at all?
Yeah, he's the I believe he's the decoder. I think he's more popular today probably for his status as a homosexual man for what happened after the war. But correct me if I'm wrong, I think he was a decoder during the war, right?
Well, it depends what circles you run in. If you run in my circles, which is sort of IT and networking, he is the reason why we have computers. Like the reason why we're talking right now is because of Alan Turing. He invented the modern computer and did so in such a way that nobody had ever thought of. He is one of the names up there that gave us computers. Without him, we probably would not be talking right now because our level of computing would be so, we'd only be up to a certain point by now. Right. So yeah.
And so to be clear, I actually don't disagree with you as far as the, when you say I think a lot of secular humanists would be willing to sacrifice their lives for things like this. I not only do I agree with that, but I actually am counting on it, right? Because when I'm making an argument like this, part of what I'm assuming in making the argument is that likely you will have the same moral values in regards to human dignity and liberty and so on that I would.
Yes, sure.
But where my issue comes in, though, and then what the argument is meant to expose, whether or not it does a good job, of course, is why we're here, is that I don't know if it can necessarily be justified from that position. Now, that's not to say that you can't believe that. I would much prefer to live in a society where people believe the right things for the wrong reasons than people believe the wrong things for the right reasons, or even some variation of that. But when it comes to, and this is why I think I use the example of the hopeless empire, and maybe even, or the hopeless fight, right? And maybe even putting specifics to it can be detrimental to my point. Although maybe not. I guess I don't know. That depends on how each individual is taking what's being said, right? Anyways, I'm out here caveating myself to death. Is in a situation, if it is truly hopeless, and let's just for the sake of argument assume that it is, then the how do I want to put this? The options are essentially to have physical flourishing at the expense of ideas considered more abstract or transcendent, depending on which circle you'll run in, or neither at all. And I think a lot of us, probably yourself included, would say actually neither at all is the better of the two options. If I can be the the slave of a tyrant, or me and my society in total are destroyed. And those are the only two options I have, just hypothetically assuming there isn't a third. I actually would prefer the destruction of my society in defiance of that despotic empire. And I would completely agree with that if that's something that you would end up saying. I would just simply point out that it's contrary to this idea of flourishing, because what you're essentially saying is the abstract ideals of liberty and nationhood and all these kinds of things actually outweigh whether or not I would be I or my family or my society at large, or even the world, assuming it's hopeless and therefore you would have no impact, are actually going to have are going to create a situation with more flourishing. And you could actually do an alternate history sort of thing, right? Hypothetically, had the Germans won and the Polish resistance was thoroughly crushed, the one thing you potentially have to not, quote unquote, look forward to, and I say quote unquote because of course you'll be dead, is that 150 years down the line, people will look at your loss and say, you know what, actually, those men were the kind of men I would like to emulate. And that's not actually a far-flung example. I don't know the history of Australia's war with the indigenous, but I do know the history of my own country. And, that's what the survivors, as well as those of us who are not Native American, have to look back on is, wow, Geronimo's bravery, But it's not like he actually accomplished anything. In fact, if anything, one could argue he made the situation worse by fighting. I would argue that was a just and honorable thing to quote unquote make the situation worse, because it was that or the willing servitude of your people. But that's really the only thing he accomplished is his name in the history books. You know what I mean?
Do you think that the French resistance, do you think they should have fought on and died rather than lay low and then take actions afterwards?
Well, in their case, it is a different way of going about resistance, so I wouldn't take any issue with that. Those in Vichy France who capitulated, I would have a problem with. But those who were perhaps a little bit more deceptive about the way they fought, I think that's more just intelligent battle strategy than anything else. Ultimately, they were still resisting. And
Yes.
of course, men like Charles de
Yeah.
Gaulle are a testament to that.
Yeah, so this is why I think it's sort of the whole idea of, well, you can't, the only moral action to take is fighting to the death against this evil empire is, I think it isn't a great example, because we have examples of people that didn't fight, like Schindler, for instance, who pretended to be on board with the Nazis and yet saved so many Jewish people. People that have used deception and sort of given in for all intents and purposes, yet still in their own way resisted. We remember them too. So I think this idea of, well, it's either you surrender and sort of give up, or you fight to the death, isn't really reflective of reality.
Well, even in that situation, I would argue that they are part of the second category. And to use an example
Sure.
of that, when they were exposed, which did very often happen. I don't know how often it happened in France. They tended to be, Charles de Gaulle, of course, was not secret about it at all, but he was also in England. So it didn't really impact him a whole lot.
Well, enough. They were discovered enough to be killed, sure.
Yeah. But like, so as an example with the Ukrainians, which I'm a little bit more aware of just from a historical perspective. When the secret fighters were eventually exposed, the result was the annihilation of entire villages sometimes. And in fact, there's some pretty brutal stories of what the SS was capable of. Not that shocks anybody at all.
Well, yeah.
as far as their combat against Polish and Ukrainian rebels on the Eastern Front. So even in that case, there is still this notion of the fight to the death, even at the potential detriment of our society, is better. And I agree with those people completely. I totally think that was the right move, as bad as the potential consequences could be for failure. Ultimately, things like the dignity of the person and nationhood, I think, do outweigh the potential to live a shall we say, physically fulfilling life, which you could argue, depending on which specific empire. In the case of the Nazis, it's a little bit poor example, only because that wasn't possible for them either. They're almost cartoonishly evil.
So if we both agree that you should fight evil empires to the death and regardless of the consequence, and there were atheists that fought that particular evil empire to the death, I don't understand how you're getting to. I mean, on all sides, like, it doesn't matter what the moral system people followed. People could have been religious, people could have been atheists, people could have been whatever. That they still made different choices in that, right? So you're sort of talking about past events. Oh, some people fought, some people didn't. I don't understand why you're sort of saying, well, a secular humanist. It seems like you're sort of saying, well, a secular humanist wouldn't do this, and I'm wondering why.
No, my point would be, and I do appreciate the opportunity to clarify. What my point would be is not that the secular humanist wouldn't do these things.
Right.
But my point would be is that the secular humanist, I don't think, can, within the confines of his own system, justify these things. It is my conviction that for the most part, those of the humanist or liberal, and by liberal I mean philosophically speaking, or maybe I guess the answer would be politically philosophically speaking, not like current Democrats or anything like that. But I think typically they act in contrast with their ideology, even though they may not realize.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think that sort of when you're talking about fundamental human needs and when you're part of a species or a society, the society being preserved is more important than the individual. To quote Spock, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. I think it is entirely within human nature to sacrifice for your fellow humankind. And that is a central premises of secular humanism. That in a way we all sacrifice for humankind. We work on things that will not benefit us in the long run. We sacrifice our lives for certain things that will not benefit us in the long run.
Right, but would it be, because when we talk about like the Spock quote, for example, that's a sort of a utilitarian idea of, or maybe you could even call it consequential, but it's sort of like consequential utilitarian, so you could just mix them, right? Idea of these things ultimately for good, right? And in many cases that's true. So the death of the individual soldier, or even potentially an individual city, or even an individual nation in a multi-nation conflict like World War II. But the result of that is V-Day or VE Day or VJ Day or whatever, right? But what I'm getting at is, in the case of, and admittedly, you have to personalize it in World War II, but there are other wars in which you would not have to personalize it, like wars against the Native Americans and so on. In a situation where the benefit for the society does not actually happen, and maybe even before you have your ultimate destruction, it will never actually happen, which I think is very often the case. The famous last stand kind of idea, right? Is it still at that point right for a people to have open defiance against the tyrant, knowing full well that there is no benefit other than their open defiance in the face of tyranny. Now, I think the
But
majority of
you
people
pointed out the benefit. You pointed out the benefit
being what?
being that it's defiance itself that will cause more defiance. It will cause more people to rise up. It is the nature of humans to find courage from the actions of others. You pointed it out earlier. Like, we still tell stories about this sort of the 300 standing at Thermopylae. And by the way, it wasn't just Spartans. I believe there was Thespians and another group of people, Boeotians, I think, in there as well, who aren't remembered, which is funny because they all stood there and they all died there. So I try to remember the other people that were forgotten that made that ultimate sacrifice as well. The whole idea that your sacrifice can be inspirational for others is enough. And it is sort of, you're talking like, well, you know that your efforts will be in vain. And I don't think we will ever know that. I think that you're assuming that people know that to start with. And I don't think that's the case. You would have to have foreknowledge of the future in order to know that. But if we can sacrifice ourselves to say, hey, a person down the line is going to rise up and challenge this horrible idea, then that's enough.
Well, let's ask a hypothetical that it is totally a thought experiment, right? But removing the actual players.
Okay. Well, as long as it's reasonable, like that we don't have foreknowledge of the future, that it's a reasonable hypothesis. So go.
Yeah. So let's say you are in a situation where you are as confident as could be. We could attempt to make it stronger by adding fictional elements, but just for the moment, we'll just scratch those and say you're as confident as you could possibly be that you will die in vain against this evil empire, right? So, and this isn't entirely unreasonable, right? Like a Gaulish rebel fighting against Caesar, he can't see the fact that the next 500 years will be dominated by Caesar and his descendants in the Roman Empire, and that the Gauls will practically not even exist at a certain point in time, albeit, of course, their descendants exist in some capacity. But he could maybe say, like, I can, do the whole wind test, lick the finger, see the wind, see where it's going, kind of thing. And I have a very strong conviction that this is probably the way it's going, right? In a situation where you are as confident as you could possibly be that you will die in vain, and that this will therefore not benefit or not result in net benefit for humanity or for your individual group or for your individual family, and certainly not for you. Is it still just to fight anyways, knowing that your group is the group you're fighting against is tyrannical?
Yes.
And I would agree, by the way. So we're in agreement with that.
Yeah. Now, so the thing is that the history of humanity has been still continuing in impossible odds. There's no history where people thought, oh well, I'm gonna lose, that we haven't decided to fight anyway. And you're sort of forgetting the emotional connections to things like family and the rest of humanity to sort of go, oh, well, it's hopeless, I'm just going to lay down. We are a social creature, so we do care what happens to our family and our friends and all of the people that are left behind. And I firmly believe that it is within me and within humanism to say that I will fight to the death for people's right for these fundamental human givens. I don't see a problem with that. And so it seems to me that just as a person that doesn't adhere to humanism, you're leveraging something on humanism which just isn't true. It's kind of like the no atheists in foxholes kind of sentiment, it seems to me, because you're sort of saying, hey, I don't see a reason why humanists would fight to the death to preserve a flourishing society of content humans, as opposed to a tyrannical dictatorship which causes death and destruction.
Well, I think one of the issues that we might be running into here is in the analogy I'm giving, we're sort of already assuming that won't happen. Now, it's what you're fighting for, in a sense, in the sense that that's the reason you've decided to pick up arms. But you've also come to the conclusion that your efforts will be in vain in such a situation. And I think you and I could agree, both historically and in the present, and just as a matter of thought experiment, there certainly are those who, in a rather cowardly fashion, have said, well, yeah, actually it is hopeless. So why bother, why bother kicking against the pricks? I'll just capitulate and then live out the rest of my days in what little amount of peace and prosperity I'm able to attain from that, right? Now, you and I would both agree that person was wrong for doing what he did. And we would maybe even both use the strong language of cowardice to describe something like that. But it certainly did happen. And there are certainly also situations in the reverse where, even though all odds were stacked against them, they fought on anyway, and it turned out to be all for naught, with the exception of the display of their resistance, right? Now, what my contention is not that you wouldn't do that, or that I couldn't see an atheist do that, or a humanist doing that, or what have you. My contention is simply that even though they would do that, they're operating in a way that is contrary to simple human reasoning. They're fighting for abstract ideals, like resistance to tyranny is ultimately better than flourishing, or human liberty, though it may not be physical flourishing, is ultimately to be preserved for, and maybe even died for, right?
Well, hold on a second. Hold on. So I think I don't like this, because you're sort of saying that well-being is an abstract ideal. Do you think well-being is just an abstract?
Well, certainly in some situations it is. If you're talking about the physical well-being, then no. We know,
Yes.
we know what it means to be fed. We know what it means to be healthy. We know what it means to all that things, right? But in many other ways, I think you could certainly say it's abstract. I mean, rights, for example, are, I think, as abstract as you can get. And that even goes for somebody like me who believes that they are objectively true. They're still in the abstract, though. Like, there's no physical thing called the freedom of speech, right? So that's or nationhood, or you could even argue things like bodily autonomy in a sense.
Sure.
Is a abstract ideal, right? That doesn't make it a negative thing by any means, or even something that is not objective. Again, I as a objectivist would say that all of these things are ultimately grounded in an objective reality. But they are certainly what we as thinkers would refer to as abstract ideals.
Well, some of them, yes, but some are not. Like, for instance, your social needs, for instance, right? So your attachment to family and friends and things like that. I'm not sure I would say that they are abstract in its entirety. It may be that sort of we talk about a friendship, say, as an abstract, but that's a real person, right?
Well, yeah, and I could even grant you that you can measure the impact of a friendship in tangible terms, right? Like,
Correct. Yes.
I can look at people who have no friends in comparison to people who do have friends, and see the well-being of each in a scientific capacity, right?
But don't you think we can measure the same for things like your sense of identity, your self-actualization, your safety and security? All of those are based upon emotions, but we can get a good idea of what they are.
I think to an extent you certainly could. I don't know if it's as robust of an extent as you might be thinking, though.
Well, no, I mean, I never said it was that robust. I think you mean sort of well defined. Yes, it's not that well defined, but we can certainly sort of point to somebody on the street missing these critical human needs and say, hey, part of their unhealthy lifestyle is the missing of these needs. And we can point to somebody who does have a lot of safety and security, familial connection, all of these societal needs met, and say, hey, that person is doing better.
Well, even then, though, that's going to be something that is subject to, number one, your own values, and also number two, even just specific situations. I mean, not only would it not be hard to conceive of a thought experiment, it wouldn't be hard to conceive of a historical example where the freer society was actually much worse off than the more tyrannized society. In fact, you could just think of one right now. The Saudis, despite being in a brutal theocracy, certainly have much more physical and financial flourishing than, say, the Syrians of the last 20 years, despite the fact that one of them technically has a democracy and a set of human liberties, right?
Well, I think there's more to that. If I mean, you're talking Syria, a place that's been in war for, like, I don't understand why that would be even vaguely analogous.
Well, even before the war, right?
Even sure, before, but there was a whole load of, like, Syrians didn't have the oil that the Saudis did to provide their people with such a grandiose sort of lifestyle. There's a whole load of other things behind that you're completely ignoring. And no humanist is saying everybody should have absolute freedom or, the ability to do whatever they want. Just things like sort of autonomy and identity doesn't mean unlimited amounts. Nobody's saying that.
Well, I think that is one potential reason you could say. I would argue that certain societies, and it's unfortunate, and I don't think this is good. It is better if these societies were to change in such a way that this would not be true. But there are certain societies where sectarian division, or ethnic division, or political division, or what have you, certain traditional morals that are steeped and have not yet gone by the wayside, that they are so detrimental to things like flourishing that actually the more tyrannical society is better at that point in time. But I think there's no clearer example of this than Iraq. Iraq, by many standards.
Careful there, you're getting into moral relativism there, CJ.
Well, bear in mind here that I don't actually how do I want to put this? I don't actually agree with the premises of things like flourishing, right? So for the example I'm about to give, somebody like Saddam Hussein, though he certainly kept order better than the democracy did in Iraq, I still think ultimately that's not what makes him a good or a bad ruler. What makes him a good or a bad ruler is for me, based in things which are more quote unquote abstract than that. But from a simple perspective of mere flourishing, the ruler and government which gave less dignity actually had the more, at least from on paper, actually had a more successful society to such an extent.
I think you're really sort of getting into so what you're doing is you're sort of saying, hey, that a democratic government to come after Saddam was destabilized. And there's a lot of other reasons for that. I think you're sort of applying a very simplistic sort of, well, the one with more freedom was more destabilized. Yes, but the Americans had been through there and killed millions of people and created a power vacuum for ISIS. Like the amount of external things to be happening there is incredible. So I really don't think it's fair to compare the regime under Saddam Hussein to the sort of power vacuum that was left when America went through and wiped him out.
Well, actually, I think you're maybe unintentionally bolstering my point here, though, right? Because that power vacuum was filled up with a very violent sectarian division that had no opportunity to bloom beforehand because they were all under the thumb of the self-same tyranny, right? Now,
Well,
after that,
it was the democracy that you're referring to was sort of instituted by the American government to provide, some sort of freedoms to the people.
right, and it ultimately turned out to be a very disastrous experiment. Now, if we want to
Sure,
talk about solutions to this sort of thing, I do think there are solutions to be had.
but
I mean, I don't know.
was that a secular humanist society?
I think it certainly tried to be, right?
No, come on, CJ. The average people of Iraq were not secular humanists. They were
Well,
Muslim. Let's face it.
I mean, don't
The,
get me wrong, though. There is, first off, I think we can be. There are certainly Muslims who are also humanists, right? There are. I think every religion has people which try to
sure,
be secular,
definitely not the majority, though.
and I have no denial of that, right? But what my point here is that you have a society that, in this case, we have a society that has deep sectarian divisions. There are even some historians which think Britain might have dropped the ball and Iraq shouldn't actually exist as a nation. It should be smaller nations, like Kurdistan, for example. Whether or not you believe that or not, the
Sure.
point is to say it's agreed that this society has deeply divided, right?
Okay.
Now, the society was unable to have those divisions manifest in a violent way because everybody was under the thumb of a very vicious dictator who was concerned with his own kind of ego cult, for lack of a better term, in the form of Saddam Hussein, right? When that was removed,
Yes.
the sectarian divisions boiled up to the top, such that not just ISIS, you had Kurdish communists, Kurdish nationalists, Assyrian fighters, Armenian or not Armenian, Aramaic fighters who were part of the Assyrian group but nevertheless have a different ethnic identity, secular Iraqi government, and so on and so forth, right? And everything became kind of a disaster. Now, again, I want to be clear. I don't
Oh,
actually.
yeah. That's what happens when you destabilize a government. Yeah, that happens all over the world when you destabilize a government.
Right, but when you destabilize, the point that I'm making here, though, is that from the perspective of flourishing, the tyrant
Yes.
did better than the one that actually provided people with a certain level of autonomy. Now, that in my eyes, you got to remember, in my eyes, I don't think that that necessarily matters, because in the case of Saddam Hussein, regardless of if he or any other dictator for that matter,
So you
regardless of
think Saddam Hussein was moral?
person, right?
So
Sorry,
do
say
you
again?
think Saddam Hussein was moral?
No, certainly not. That's the point
Well,
I'm making
then
right now, right?
what's
Where
the
it's like,
problem? Sort of, if you don't think you're sort of trying to argue that it was better, that we ought to have Saddam Hussein in there in order to govern the country, a
yeah,
vicious
so
dictator who, I might add, gassed his own people.
yeah, in fact, 2 million Kurds at one point in time as well, which is
Right.
more
I
vicious.
don't think we ought to have had him, but I don't think we ought to have gone in and removed him at the cost of millions of Iraqi people either. I think we ought to have given the people had their choice in who they wanted to rule them.
Right. So, and this is where I have to be clear here. I'm speaking of an internal critique, right? In my worldview
An internal critique of what?
of the humanistic concept of flourishing being better and of abstract morals like uh,
So,
uh,
do you think that that country would have flourished better with a benevolent leader who represented everybody rather than an American placed democracy, a vicious tyrant, or a vicious, ISIS led horrible thing?
well, certainly, if you had a perfect world, a benevolent leader would be best, right? But what my point is in saying this, right, is if we're taking flourishing as the metric, right? whether that be physical flourishing or even using some abstract things like bodily autonomy and stuff like that. If that's the metric, which again, we must remember it's not my metric, right? So this does what I'm saying here wouldn't apply to me because I use a completely different metric. But if flourishing is the metric, the dictatorship was much more successful. And if that means, if better flourishing means better morality, by this system, it would be much more moral than the republic.
Yeah. But CJ, you've got to listen to what I say, because I don't feel like you're actually hearing what I say. Because what I said is, yes, flourishing is important. The metric is really well-being. And while the society was kept coherent and stabilized by Saddam Hussein, I could not say in all honesty that they were doing well under Saddam Hussein, who gassed his own people. And also, when we talk about these fundamental needs of humans, as I said earlier, they can't be violated in secular humanism, right? Not unless someone's violating your own. So with the evil empire willing to destroy you, then you can defend your fundamental rights. But you don't get to destroy somebody else's fundamental right because it helps society flourish. So one of those rights is bodily autonomy and sort of a level of autonomy, decision making and identity, which you can say that Saddam Hussein decimated that of his people. He kept them under brutal crackdowns, just non-judicial killings all the time. And again, he literally used biochemical weapons on his own people. So you don't get to appeal to, well, the society all flourish at the cost of the individual members. You don't get to do that, because that's not what secular humanism promotes. It just doesn't. I'm sorry.
But isn't that what you were just saying earlier in the case of warfare, is that it in fact does promote that? That the individual...
No, because people are defending their own fundamental rights.
So I guess I don't think that's a clear distinction, though, because if we're saying that the detriment of individuals, if it means greater flourishing for the society, or even you can use the term well-being for society, in some cases, but not in others, then I don't understand, I guess, where we would have it seems now it's not a legitimate or concrete reasoning anymore, right?
Well, it never is with morality. It's one of the most complex subjects you're ever going to talk about. And some Christians and some people of Islam would say, like you said, they're humanists. They have different views than other people in it. I'm not pretending like it's all just one view. What I'm telling you is my view. That it is not something you can do to violate these rights. And that may be worth somebody laying down their life for. That it might be worth laying down your life for a society, sure. But that doesn't mean that you just allow people to violate your rights because that gives a more stable society.
Well, so really quickly, I want to get a point of clarification as far as thought experiments and things like that are concerned. Would you consider it justified to make applications based off of what I say, even if I would reject those applications? So, like, for example, if I were to say my morality is based on a literal interpretation of Scripture, and let's say that we are in the 1860s and I'm an abolitionist. If you were to respond with, okay, but a literal interpretation of Scripture to me sounds certainly like there are endorsements of slavery. Even if I were to say, no, that's not what I'm saying, I don't believe in slavery, you would think that's a legitimate application, right? Because you're taking the logic I've presented you with and running with it in an attempt to show why you don't think it works.
Yes, but I wouldn't sort of say that that's your belief.
Right. I don't think any of these things are your belief. Right. What I'm doing is making application to what I think has been provided, right? um, and taking it to what I see as a logical conclusion. I don't believe that you agree with the idea that the evil tyrant is better than the free society if the evil tyrant increases flourishing and the free society
Well,
doesn't.
can we keep to well-being? Because I never said flourishing was sort of the utility. I've always said it's well-being. So let's stick to that.
Well, sure, we could say that.
Sure.
I don't necessarily know the difference if I'm being honest with you, but for the sake of terminology, I have no problem with that.
Okay, sure. Okay, so will the question is, will somebody flourish under a tyrannical society? Will they get their fundamental needs met? Okay, so keep this in mind. Okay, so think about this. Will the individual, just the average person on the street, get their needs met by a tyrant? So what are we talking about? We're talking food, water, shelter, right? Those things. Yeah, maybe. Will they get their sense of identity met? No. Will they get their safety and security met? Hell no. Will they get their sense of freedom met? No. Will they get their ability to self-actualize, to reach their full potential in society? Absolutely not.
And is it possible to have a society where, and just to not bury the lead here, I think it's not only possible, but that it's happened numerous times. Is it possible to have a society where having your identity and your emotional needs and things like that, your national identity, your religious identity, just individual self identity, where having those things sacrificed ends up producing a society that has greater net well-being than the opposite? Because I believe that has happened numerous times. I think there has been many societies where the dictator actually has provided a greater well-being overall than the possibility of having, and usually it's due to sectarian divisions. That tends to be the reason why something like this occurs. Where the dictator, the tyrant, though he is vicious and cruel, actually creates a greater net well-being than when each individual or even a greater number of individuals have their more abstract ideals fulfilled, because there's such a division within the society that those abstract ideals inevitably lead to violent conflict. I think Iraq's a good example of that. I think that there are numerous other examples, like Afghanistan tends to be a good example of that as well. They're very tribally divided, where ultimately, if the metric, and again, my metric is not, but if the metric is a greater net well-being, then the evil guys are a lot better at maintaining order and therefore creating thriving well-being than the good guys are.
Yeah, and I don't see that as well-being. I think that the people are stable, but I don't think they're well. I think they ought to search for a region, and you're sort of giving it to, oh, what's the greater evil kind of thing. A dictator that keeps the region stable and stops everyone from being killed, or a absolute anarchy. And I think that, yeah, a dictator that keeps the region from falling apart is better, but I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm saying it's the lesser of two evils, as you probably would as well. Would you rather a sort of a dictator hold a region together and less people die and there's not just fighting and war, or would you rather there to be war?
Well, it is a difficult question. From my perspective, I don't necessarily, how do I want to put this? I don't necessarily think that warfare is always a bad thing. If it means that, I mean, back to the previous example I gave about courage,
Well, hold on. No. I want to use my example here. So just say there are sectarian nations that are going to absolutely slaughter each other and all the civilians around them, regardless of what they believe. Imagine the tribal fighting in Africa, for instance. Would you rather the wholesale slaughter and murder of all these people, including innocent civilians, or a dictator to keep the region stable? Which would you prefer?
Well, I wasn't, just so you know, I wasn't jumping to a new topic. I was simply getting a point of reference.
I'm not on a new topic. It's exactly the same topic. It's the
No, I
question
know.
you asked.
My point, though, is not that I'm not trying to go back to the previous example in the sense of changing the topic. What I'm saying is, as I said earlier, I think it is better for a group to, at least, you know, from a moral perspective, I mean, I think it is better for a group to willingly sacrifice itself than to be under the confines of a dictatorship, even though that dictatorship may provide more pragmatic well-being. So, like, for example, when the Kurds fight, does it end?
Well, hold on. Let's examine that. So you think it's moral for there to be a dictator to stop the horrendous violence that occurs?
No, from my view, I think it is better for the individual societies to fight than it is for them to accept the greater well-being.
So you would rather innocent people be slaughtered wholesale than the alternative of a dictator controlling the country and maybe is ousted later?
Ultimately, I do think that is the better of the two evils. I think they're both evil, but I don't think flourishing is the or even well-being, because I don't think that is the ultimate.
Well, let's look at that. Don't you care if your society is flourishing? Don't you care if your family is flourishing? Don't you care about that?
Certainly, I'm not saying flourishing is a bad thing. I'm just saying that I don't think it's the end all be all. I think there is a point where you could be in a society that has lower well-being overall, that is ultimately more moral, given the reasons that it's decided to have its lower well-being.
So you would rather your family be wiped out than living under a dictatorship?
I think I would. And let me give an example of this where we've seen exactly that play out. I think you would probably agree with me, and if not, feel free to correct, that the freedom of slaves is ultimately better for them than the non-freedom of slaves, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So now the way which we accomplished that, at least in the United States of America, I know very little about Australia's slave trade, if it even existed. But the way we accomplished that was ultimately fairly detrimental to the well-being, especially of the southern states, to such an extent that some areas haven't even recovered today, 150 years later, right?
Well,
now, ultimately,
slavery is generally bad, even for the slave masters. It wipes out the middle class because you essentially have a lower class that isn't being paid anything. They don't buy anything. So generally what we know about slavery is that it's bad for everybody and bad for the society.
And that could even be true, but what I think is probably much worse for the society is being pummeled into oblivion and seeing 300,000 of their young men killed. Which is what happened.
Are you talking about the Confederacy?
Yes. So my point here is...
Wait, the Confederacy that declared the United States a oppressive, tyrannical government and rebelled against the Union?
Yeah. So again, my point is in saying this is that's a perfect situation to describe where, to elucidate this idea of the flourishing, the well-being, the living of your family was ultimately not the right option. The right option was the fight, right? So for my view,
Confederacy, you think the right option was to fight?
No, I'm speaking about for those who wanted to abolish slavery.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I thought you were talking about the other side. I'm like, yeah, they didn't have to do that. I mean, they basically said that God gave them the right to slaves, and that they were going to fight for the right to own slaves. Sure. And I think that if you are a humanist, I think you should fight for the freedoms of others. Sure.
Well, and setting that to the side only for a moment, just because the ultimate point here I'm trying to make is, because you had asked the question, do I think it's better to have a society which is internally fighting, or a society where the order is preserved by a dictator? And my point there was saying that when we have this example of the Civil War, and there's countless examples throughout history of a similar thing, what we see is actually the death and destruction, as vile as that is, from a certain perspective, if you're more interested in the abstracts than you are in the well-being, that was actually the better option, even though it meant the complete and total destruction of the southern states and a complete abolition of race relations, which were already terrible to begin with.
Well, I don't think the southern states were destroyed by that. I think they surrendered, and yes, there was a lot of damage done, but I don't think it's coloring it in the same way that sort of the South was going around. That it fell into violence where civilians were being killed wholesale, like the African example. I don't think that's a thing. I think that sort of helping the slaves and liberating the slaves was a worthwhile goal for the abolitionists. I don't see why that would be a problem. But it's not like we're talking about, well, if the people don't fight the dictator, they're going to be killed wholesale. I don't think that's the same thing.
Well, if you mean the same thing as in 100% identical, I guess I would agree. But I would say it's the same thing as far as it's the decision that order and stability and well-being take a back seat to these things that we typically consider as abstract, like human dignity and nationality.
Well, no, the South wasn't destroyed. Race relations, sort of saying, oh well, it harmed race relations with the alternative being enslaved. I think I would say, then screw the race relations. The people have a right to their freedom, regardless of what that does to race relations. I think that's one of the weirdest things I've ever heard.
I think you're misunderstanding me. I agree with that. My point, though, is that's exactly what I'm saying. Is that these things like flourishing, well-being, order, stability, ultimately, those things were not actually the moral option. This is why I referred to it as an
because because we're not just looking at for us, right? We're looking at it like, again, I have to say this again, we're looking at ourselves as a species, as for all humans, including black humans, and their well-being is important too. You're sort of looking at it, well, is it well-being for my society? Is it well-being for me personally? And that is not what secular humanism is about. It's saying, hey, the well-being of those people is worth fighting for, even at detriment to myself. The well-being of the species is worth fighting for, even at the detriment to myself and to my societal structure that's localized to me. At the end of the day, we know at the moment that we're on a very small hunk of Earth that's hurtling through the galaxy at incredible speeds. We have got to come together as one species and work for the well-being of all. That's it. Like, you're trying to make these divisions which sort of say, hey, why sacrifice yourself for the well-being of somebody else? Because that's what secular humanism is about. That's what we do.
Yeah, I think I don't think that what am I trying to say here? I don't think that the issue that I'm trying to elucidate here is necessarily the same as the one which you might think I'm trying to elucidate, because I'm not talking about even individuals. I'm talking about in a net sense.
Yes.
There are, in fact, just as an example, there's a guy on YouTube here named MJ Jackson. Whether or not you agree with him or not, of course, is a different question, but he would be associated with like the kind of like the Black Lives Matter kind of groups from a religious perspective, but nevertheless, that's sort of his ideology. And he would tell you that things actually got, now he's not, bear in mind, he's not supporting slavery by any means. That's why I point out he's one of the BLM kind of guys. That's his sort of ideology. But he would posit that that the overall quality of living for Black people in America was worse between 1865 and 1965 than it was during the times of slavery. Now, he uses that as an indictment on postbellum society. He does not use that.
Yeah, and that was Jim Crow and stuff, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So he's not using that to argue for the.
Yeah, I don't think that's right either. I think Jim Crow was horrendous as well from a secular humanism point of view.
Oh no, certainly, right. And bear in mind that whenever I'm saying these things, I'm not accusing you of agreeing with these things. I'm simply making application based on what I see as the internal logic, right? Now, that claim, if let's just assume Jackson is right about that, maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but assuming he's right about that, then wouldn't, if it's worse for the next 100 years for the entire society of Black Americans and for the entire society of the South, post-war than pre-war, then if well-being is the goal, isn't the Civil War immoral? And if it's moral because of things like freedom and liberty, more abstract ideals than overall well-being, then doesn't that demonstrate an example? Isn't that an example, excuse me, of the well-being argument not working? Now, I think it's
no, because you're only looking at it in very short terms, whereas the secular humanist takes a very long view of things. So when you weigh up the well-being of 300,000 people that died in the Civil War, for instance, versus the ongoing billions of people that would be subject to arbitrary killings, sort of lynchings, the rape and captivity of Black women that happened at the time, all of that suffering, right? That the sheer suffering that you're sort of, I think that you're glossing over by saying, hey, they were sort of in a good situation, or they were more well-being. No, they weren't in a good situation. So if you weigh that up versus the sacrifice is worth it. Because if you allow that institution to keep going on, the sheer amount of suffering that people will go through is horrendous. It's uncountable. You have to end that institution. It has to end. So I think that you're looking at things in a very, very short-term view. Does this immediately give my society a better well-being, or does it not? And the secular humanist goes, how are we going to be 1,000 years in the future, 2,000 years in the future, with these institutions still there? Is this worth something getting rid of, or should this continue? And this is why we have such a strong objection to it, because we're looking far, far into the future. Because we don't, and I don't mean to sort of, I know this isn't about your religion, but we don't think the world's going to end. We think these institutions will be around as long as humans are. And our goal is to make humans around for as long as possible.
Well, I certainly wouldn't disagree with that element. And, in so much as if we're saying that, well, centuries and centuries down the line, it might get better, I guess in a way, it's a little bit of an unfalsifiable argument, only because we don't necessarily know. and really can't know. In fact, really, I mean, we today are not even 100% certain of the consequences of events that happened 1,000 years ago, right? So and that's not to say you're necessarily wrong. Just to say there's not much that I could say for or against that thought, but I would say a century of, and again, you might disagree with some of the leaders of the modern African, well, I guess it's African American, not African, but nevertheless, community. I actually kind of would agree more with the person who does disagree with them. But the point is, if we could just grant their argument for the sake of argument, if it is true that the next 100 years was worse from a well-being perspective than the previous 100 years because of this event which took place, and well-being is the ultimate goal, then it seems reasonable to suggest that that event was a negative thing. And if we're not going to say that that was a negative thing, which I don't believe that it is, then the counter argument to that is then well-being is not the ultimate goal. The goal is what philosophers tend to refer to as things which are more abstract. Dignity is dignity regardless of if you're fed. Dignity is dignity regardless of if you're content, right?
Well, I've already talked about fundamental human needs. I've already talked about that.
Right, I get that, but I mean, you would certainly have to concede that something like dignity is a lot more contentious? That is the right word. Yes, contentious, abstract, argued upon than something like whether or not you're fed and mentally,
Sure.
happy, I guess, so to speak. So then to get this all back to the happy's not the right word, but I'm losing what the right word actually is. So then to get back to this ultimate thing, right? We're talking about well-being as the grounding for whether or not morality, something is moral or not.
Yes.
Well, if the abstracts must suffer so that physical well-being can be increased, if that's a bad thing and only potentially a good thing 1,000 years down the road, which we may never know, and even can't be known by the historians 1,000 years ago.
I never said that.
Well, you did argue that we're talking about looking long term, and that a century was not long enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's so just a second, because I want to make it clear what happened in the Civil War as well. That they outlawed slaves, or they made slaves illegal, and the Confederacy wouldn't give up their right to slaves. But I sort of want to challenge you with what would happen if the Confederacy were secular humanists. What would they have done then, if rather than being sort of having a theistic position on that God allows them to have slaves, what if they were secular humanists?
Well, I don't think we can necessarily say, only because I don't think each individual secular humanist would have the same idea as the other.
Really?
I think there would be many secular humanists that are actually more in line with my perception of secular humanism, in that it's a much more utilitarian worldview for them than yours is. I think.
Why do you think secular humanism would support? Why do you think that they would ever support slavery? If your fundamental beliefs are that all people need well-being, safety, security, freedom, that kind of thing, how would it be possible for a secular humanist to be a slaver?
Well, I think that's kind of funny, because an example, now I will grant you that this individual is not secular, he's a Catholic. That being said, he was a humanist. Thomas More, writer of the famous work Utopia, actually thought that slavery would have to be a fundamental part of a utopian society, right? So now your particular, and you could of course turn this around on me if we were talking about Christianity. I don't deny that. Your particular flavor of humanism might not be in that vein, and well and good. I would prefer your view on humanism over against somebody like Thomas More, right? But Thomas More, it's not even just that slavery is permissible in his utopia. Slavery is required in his utopia. And I think there's...
I don't see how he was a humanist then.
Well, because these things that you're talking about, things like well-being and flourishing and stuff like that, unless you're talking strictly about the physical, they are very abstract and contentious. What you consider to be well-being might be different than what somebody else considers to be well-being, right? In the Thomas More view, the well-being of society was the best possible well-being for everybody who we can make it for, but that requires stepping on the toes of others. Which
okay, but
the eugenic
you've got two different groundings there, because Thomas More was basing it in religion and ours is based in science.
I mean, if you think that would make a big deal, I guess then that would be a potential point for us to debate. Certainly,
probably, yeah, probably, because sort of when I'm talking about these fundamental needs, I'm not sort of, this is my opinion on what they are. We're taking them from a lot of research in psychology and psychiatry to know what makes fundamental human needs.
Sorry, say that again.
We're not sort of saying, hey, what's my opinion about fundamental needs? We're taking them from a lot of research in psychology and psychiatry to know what the needs of a human are, like not only physically but mentally. Obviously, medicine and anatomy and biology would govern what the physical needs are, sure. But when you're talking about these more, abstract concepts, we're taking them from psychology and psychiatry, sociology, people studying what actually makes a society well.
Yeah, I think that is, I don't know if that necessarily is going to help, honestly, because when it comes to purely physical well-being, as I said, as we began the program, we can certainly get to a scientific understanding of what makes somebody physically well.
Yeah.
But when you start leaving health and start going into the realm even of let's just say physical health, because even in the realms of emotional health and mental health, let alone things like contentment and dignity, it's just a natural conclusion, or not conclusion, it's just a natural result of what those things are. We're going to have disputes about what exactly constitutes each one of those things. And so one humanist might say that a society that is better for the most possible people, but ultimately still quite terrible for others, is actually the preferable society, provided that a perfect society is not possible, which I think most of us would agree that at least now that's the case. And other humanists may say, no, we should try to raise the net goodness for each individual rather than
the same as
for society.
The same is true of any moral system you can care to name. I could do the same with Christianity very, very easily.
Well, bear in mind, though, this is a response to a specific question that you had asked, right? As far as if the Confederates were humanists, do you think they would have believed the way that they did? And I'm just saying, well, I mean, maybe possible. I think I can definitely see a couple humanists who would share their pro-slavery views, and I can think of humanists who wouldn't. So it would very much.
I mean, I can sort of say the modern secular humanist organizations certainly wouldn't. Like the manifesto would definitely, sort of, it would not support slavery in the slightest. I'll put it that way. There is no possible interpretation you can have of the humanist manifesto to get, well, slavery is a good thing.
Yeah, and for that particular group of humanists, I'm sure that's totally true, right? But that's just in response to that specific and limited question, though. I think that's sort of the problem with just a blanket question like that, as far as like, would this have happened if humanism was the case? Like, well, maybe, maybe not. You know, it just very genuinely depends on the person who's in charge and what their specifics of the ideology is. And to be fair, that would be true if you had excuse me, if I had asked you the same question. Like, if we were talking about Soviet Russia and I said, well, would Joseph Stalin, if he wasn't an atheist, still have murdered all those people? You could reasonably say, well,
Probably, yeah.
depends. Like, right?
Yeah.
Some Christians certainly wouldn't. Some Christians certainly would.
Well, that's
You know,
true.
so,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I don't think any modern secular humanist would sort of say that. That's the thing. That so the whole idea about it is that it does change with what our understanding of well-being is. It's not a set in stone thing. That's it. As we learn from the mistakes that humanity has made, it updates. It gets better. So with the chattel slavery in the South, we can now say that that's horrendously bad for humanity. It's an awful thing for humanity, and I completely disagree with Thomas More, as I think every single secular humanist today would. That having slaves is bad for the slaves, the slave owners, the society in general, and just all of humanity. So I think that sort of taking I'm not sure from what time Thomas More was about, that he might have thought that it is required. What late 1700s to early 1800s. That our understanding of things has changed since then, and will probably change again. That's the thing.
Well, let me give you a much more modern example then. Margaret Sanger was very racist, and it's very well documented that she was a eugenicist. Right now, leaving aside the question of her involvement in Planned Parenthood for a moment, because that's obviously a contentious topic that would devolve into speaking about that. But nevertheless, she was an avid humanist. I believe she was even a member of that Society of Humanists. By the way, Thomas More, I think, is late 1500s. I'm pretty sure he's contemporary with the Reformation. But nevertheless, and Sanger, so that's somebody who's a eugenicist, somebody who's deeply racist, and somebody who, regardless of what your own views on Planned Parenthood are, she certainly, and there are numerous records to her saying as much, thought it would be very beneficial if the group of people which was most aborted was Black people. Now, obviously, that has nothing to do with the subject.
Her reasoning was that Black people, it was because they, like, poor was her reasoning, not Black people.
Well, I'd certainly take issue with that, but nevertheless, let's just say that's true. Let's just say that's actually accurate for the sake of argument. Margaret Sanger is a humanist, right? Cenk Uygur is a humanist who denies the Armenian genocide, and there's been various things said about the views of Ted Turner, who's a member of the Humanist Society today, and so on and so forth, right? So, and my only point in bringing those up is just simply to say, in response to that question of would this still occur if it was run by humanists? But very possibly, and also very possibly not. It's too broad of a category for us to say.
Did Margaret Sanger support slavery?
Oh yeah, certainly. I think some of them would. I don't think there's any real.
I don't think so. She actually worked very closely with the Black community. She worked with James H. Hubert on the Urban League. She opened a clinic in Harlem. I think that you're sort of leveraging anybody that's done humanism to do something wrong as able to just suddenly commit atrocities, and I don't think that that's the case.
No, my only point there is saying this isn't even an indictment on humanism. I'm just simply saying to the question, there are many people who would call themselves humanists, describe themselves as humanists, who even part of these humanist societies, who nevertheless probably would support things like slavery or racism or eugenics or what have you.
Well, she may have been racist, but a lot of people back then were. That's the thing. As I sort of said, we kind of update our what we believe on what we know about humans. It's an ongoing process of making mistakes, realizing how they're detrimental to humans, and updating ourselves. Do you have any modern people who? I mean, I can point out modern people who are Christian that still support slavery. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan is a religious organization. Can you point out any secular humanist who still supports slavery?
Off the top of my head, no, but if I did some digging, I'm sure I might be able to find one. But regardless, it would be relevant to the original question because we'd be talking about 1860s humanists.
I'm sorry?
The original question was about the Confederacy, so it wouldn't necessarily be relevant anyways because we'd be talking about humanists from the 1860s.
Well, you were talking about Thomas More. You were talking about humanists from earlier than that, the late 1700s, early 1800s.
Right, but what I'm saying is, because now you're saying, okay, but what about right now? Could you find me any humanist right this very moment who would support slavery? And I'm saying, well, if you want me to restrict it to that, not off the top of my head, but if you want me to restrict it to that, then I don't think that the question would necessarily matter anyways, because we're talking about a group in the 1860s. Now, if we don't want to restrict it to that, then my use of Margaret Sanger,
what, the Ku Klux Klan,
would apply again.
It still exists. David Duke's the head of it. It still exists.
No, I know. I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying, my friend.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
If the question is, would humanists have done what the Confederacy did? I think the answer is very plainly yes. Some of them would, and some of them wouldn't. And here's some examples of people who probably would have. If the question is then changed to, okay, but would modern humanists have done that?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. But I mean, you're only looking at the secular humanist movement starting, I believe, in the 1950s. It's such a new thing. Like, it is so new. This is the thing. Like, when you're talking about humanism in general, David Duke's not the current head. Sorry, Big Bad Mummer, I thought he was. You're probably right. But if you're talking about sort of, would a humanist do this? They're not a secular humanist. Secular humanism only started very recently. I mean, I can look up when it started, but I know it's definitely into the 1940s or so.
Well, in the case of Thomas More, I think that would certainly be right, if for no other reason than Thomas More was a Catholic. But I do believe, because Margaret Sanger was a part of the Humanist Society, one of them. There's multiple, and I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head because I can't remember the specific name off the top of my head, unfortunately. But so I think it's a little bit older than that. I guess you'd have to go back and see when exactly there's also, of course, the problem of, like, does the ideology pre-exist the term being coined, which of course happens. But nevertheless, but it's interesting actually, now that this is not slavery, but just to continue to make the point. I mean, Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks is a self-described secular humanist, and I'm sure you're familiar with the controversy surrounding his, up until very recently, and we can read into that whichever way we like, but open denial of the Armenian genocide.
I've got no idea. I don't watch Cenk Uygur at all. I'm not, I generally don't watch Young Turks at all. I'm aware of them. I've seen them, and I know who you're talking about. I have no idea of any of his positions, to be honest with you.
Well, and either way, the only point is simply to say, and I think it might have diverted a little bit from the discussion, but I don't think we can make a blanket statement any individual particular group would have done X or Y given the situation, because in pretty much every group, and I would concede this for my own group as well, just to be clear, in pretty much every group, it's a mixed bag. I mean, John Brown was
Sure.
deeply religious, but so was Stonewall Jackson, right? And they're on completely different sides of the Civil War. At the same time, Margaret Sanger
Right.
was pretty racist, and at the flip side, Theodore Roosevelt's not. And they're both, I mean, Roosevelt's a Christian, but they're both self-described humanists. Well, I don't know if Roosevelt was self-described. He's certainly described by modern historians that way, but I don't know.
Oh, well, I think that's a good position to wrap up, actually, because it's been 2 hours. I lose track of the time. I was going to do an hour and a half, and it's been 2 hours. But I guess sort of as a last thing, and I'll give you the final word. That's not a problem. But I sort of want to sort of say that secular humanism, it does have a foundation, and we can definitely get oughts out of it, and I think that it does have a propensity for some of the more noble behaviors of humanity, not only for sacrifice but also of fighting for your fellow humans. And I think it has that intrinsic ideal at its core that perhaps its foundation is a scientific evaluation of the well-being of humans, yes, and I do want to say that it does rely a lot on sort of certain fields like psychology and psychiatry and medicine and biology and all that kind of thing. But I think it is a valid moral system that we can use. Anyway, I'll give you the last word, CJ. So go for it, mate. If you want to give me were your thoughts on the matter and anything that you want to sort of comment on about what you've heard?
So I will end with just as a reiteration of my position. I do think that well-being or human flourishing, which I tend to take interchangeable, but if you don't, then certainly, that is something to be considered. I don't think it suffices as a legitimate foundation for a moral society. I think it's far too ambiguous, and also does not provide us with the justifications for certain moral oughts and ought nots. That being said, for anybody who's catching up with this now, we have 2 hours of conversation where I detail why I think that and where Mark challenges me. And I think in the future, both in me challenging him and he challenging me, we should have much more conversations doing the same. So stay tuned. And by the way, I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, CJ. I appreciate it as well. And thank you so much for coming on. I do realize this was really short notice. I want to get more of these conversations happening and sort of, I do want to have a place for reasonable conversations, not just sort of, people screaming at one another. So I really do appreciate you coming on and being such a respectful and let's say classy person on here. So I really want to thank you a lot. Before I forget, I'm gonna do my banner because I've got an obligation to do my banner. Thank you everybody for your support, and thank you for listening. It's been really great. As I always say, please do be kind to yourself, be kind to each other, and I will see you in the next one. So stay tuned. We will have more of these conversations, and discuss how we want to what we ought to do, what we ought not to do, and why we should. So much love to everybody, and thank you so much.